Have you ever wondered if in middle age, after having lost almost everything, you still had the courage to place one last bet on a complete stranger? Ethan Cole did it. In the arid landscape of Dry Hollow, where time seems to have forgotten how to flow, Ethan, a widower childless, without water and penniless, signs a document he never thought he would have to sign in his life, an order for a bride by mail, not because of love, not because of romance, but because he was on the verge of losing his Whinstone farm, the last thing that connected him to meaning in life. Ethan was waiting for a normal woman, someone who needed support, someone who would step off the train with pleading eyes. But when the train doors opened, what stepped out was nothing like anything he had ever imagined. Margaret Hale, impeccably dressed with a sharp gaze and a firm stance, neither begged nor bowed, nor showed any weakness. The entire station fell silent. And in that moment, Ethan Cole forgot to breathe. If it were you, what would you do? Turn your back, out of fear of being judged, or stand tall, even though the whole town is watching? This is not just a story about an arranged marriage. This is a story about honor, choice, and a love that comes not like a miracle, but like a small light in the darkness. Stay with us. And if this story resonates with you, hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel, so we can join Ethan and Margaret on their journey where the heart of the frontier still knows how to love and revive. The town of Red Willow Crossing is nestled in the arid eastern Montana wilderness, where the railroad tracks cut across the prairie like an old, unhealing scar. No one remembers exactly when it was founded. All that is known is that it was once an important stop for cattle railroads, where the saloon's music echoed every Saturday night, and where children ran barefoot on the red dirt roads every summer. But all of that now exists only in memory, something the people of Red Willow cling to like a rickety life raft in shallow water. The ground here cracks like the skin of an old person who hasn't drunk water for years. The wind whistling through the wooden lampposts creates a groaning sound like the weary sigh of an entire land. Miriam Knox General Store has been closed for over a year. The wooden sign hanging on the porch is tilted to one side, and no one bothers to fix it. Harlan Price's barbershop is only open twice a week, not because he's lazy, but because there aren't many haircuts left. The small church at the end of the street still rings its bells every Sunday morning, but the wooden pews are more empty than people sit there. People still live in Red Willow Crossing, but they no longer live for tomorrow. They live on old stories told over and over again by the fireplace, on memories worn smooth by time. Someone once said this town didn't die of poverty, but because no one believed it could ever be revived. And amidst all that exhaustion, there was one name no one spoke aloud, but everyone knew: Silas Crow. Silas Crow didn't live in the town center. He resided on a low hill to the north, overlooking the entire Red Willow Crossing as if it were in the palm of his hand. Crow and Sons Bank stood at the main crossroads, the only brick building still standing amidst the gray, time-worn wooden houses. The police department received its salaries from that bank. The best plots of land around the old stream had all changed hands through intermediary companies, only to eventually return to a familiar name. No one called Silas Crow a bad guy. People just said he knew how to wait. Wait for droughts. Wait for debts to come due. Wait for people to get so tired that they'd sign anything put in front of them. The fear in Red Willow Crossing isn't loud. It lies in the lowered gaze when someone mentions the bank. It lies in the way people stop their conversations mid-sentence when a stranger walks by. It lies in the unnatural silence that lingers whenever someone loses land and leaves town in the night, leaving behind an empty house with its door swinging in the wind. Visitors to Red Willow Crossing often have a feeling that's hard to describe. At first, everything seems normal: the main road, the old inn, the church, the granary. But if they stay long enough, they'll realize something is wrong. Not because of violence, nor because of hunger, but because all the paths seem to lead to the same place, and there's no way out. This is no longer a town in the true sense. It's like a trap closing in very slowly, very patiently. The elderly here understand this better than anyone. They witnessed the Red Willow Crossing being built with bare hands and faith. They remember the days when the spring water was clear enough to see the bottom, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the unrestrained laughter. Now every afternoon they sit on their porches watching the sunset, a deep red like embers, and wonder, what happened to all that was once good? No one answered, and no one asked any more questions. In Red Willow Crossing, one thing was learned: hope is the most expensive thing. And amidst that town huddled in fear, there was a man who every morning would step out into the dry fields, as if simply continuing to do his part would allow the land and life to remember how to revive itself. Whinstone Farm is located nearly an hour's ride from Dry Hollow, where the prairie begins to gently slope down to the gray, rocky terrain. It was called that years ago when the wind was strong enough to turn water wheels and the rocks firm enough to build fences without fear of collapse. Now Whinstone is just an old name hanging on a faded wooden gate, creaking whenever the wind passes by. A dry, hot wind that carries more dust than hope. Ethan Cole woke up every morning before the sun rose above the horizon. Not out of diligence, but because he could no longer sleep soundly. The long nights in Whinstone passed in a thick silence where every small sound, the roof contracting with the cold, the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, was enough to pull him from his restless dreams. He would often sit up quietly without turning on the light, letting the familiar darkness embrace him for a little longer before beginning the day. Ethan had been without a wife for 7 years. Anna had passed away one early winter when the snow arrived faster than expected, and the road to town was blocked for 3 days. She left quietly as she had lived, without fuss, without reproach. Afterward, Whinstone doubled in size, not because the land expanded, but because of the emptiness. There were no footsteps behind him, no cooking fires waiting, no one to ask if he was tired. Only worked the same routine day after day. Ethan did everything he always did. He fixed the fence when it fell. He patched the barn roof when the wind blew. He checked on the livestock every morning and evening, even though their numbers had been halved by the drought. He didn't drink, gamble, or borrow recklessly. He paid his taxes on time while he could, and paid his bank interest regularly until the amount became unbearable. If there were a list of things a man should do, Ethan Cole had done it all, and that's what makes his failure so bitter in a very quiet way. The water in Whinstone had been drying up for 3 consecutive years. The small stream to the west, once deep enough for Anna to wash clothes in the summer, was now just a strip of dry mud marked by the footprints of stray livestock. Ethan dug more wells deeper than safe levels, but only encountered rock and silence. Each time the wind blew against the old unturned water wheel, he felt something heavier in his chest, though he couldn't name it. The notification from the bank arrived on a clear afternoon. An ivory-colored envelope, the handwriting neat and polite, almost cruelly so. Ethan read slowly, line by line, as if reading a long-prepared verdict. 7 days. 7 days to pay off the remaining debt. 7 days before Whinstone is foreclosed. He carefully folded the letter and placed it on the wooden table by the window, where the light was just enough to see clearly but not too harsh. Ethan didn't bang on the table. He didn't swear. He didn't tear up the letter. He just sat there for a long time, his hands on his knees, his back straight as if someone were still watching. Ethan Cole harbors no resentment. He's moved past that phase. Resentment consumes energy, and he doesn't have much left to spare for things that won't help. What he feels now is weariness. A deep weariness, not physical, but rooted in the belief that effort will eventually pay off. In Dry Hollow, Ethan was occasionally mentioned as an example. Not a bad example, but a sad one. If Ethan can't even hold out this time, someone whispered in the inn, "What can we expect?" Ethan didn't hear it, but he sensed the changing gaze each time he entered town. A gaze mixed with pity and relief. Pity for him, and relief that it wasn't their turn yet. On the afternoon of the 3rd day after receiving the letter, Ethan rode his horse to the southern edge of the land, where the fence bordered the plot that had been sold the previous year. He stood there for a long time, gazing into the distance at what had once been a continuous stretch of meadow. Now a new marker post had been driven in, painted red so bright it seemed out of place against the gray earth. He couldn't remember how long he stood there, only that for the first time in years he allowed himself to consider another possibility. Perhaps Whinstone doesn't need him anymore. Perhaps it's time to let go. But even that thought brought no relief. Only another void opened up, cold and inexplicable. That evening, Ethan lit the fire earlier than usual. He sat alone, watching the flames dance, remembering the evenings. Anna used to sit opposite him, mending clothes occasionally, looking up at him without speaking. Back then, silence was a safe haven. Now it felt like a room too large, echoing every thought he tried to avoid. 7 days isn't a long time, but it's enough for a man to reflect on his entire life. And just when Ethan Cole was beginning to believe that Whinstone would close its doors to his past at Dry Hollow Station, A slow train came to a halt carrying a woman whose appearance would force him to breathe again as if for the first time in many years. Dry Hollow train station is only truly alive for 15 minutes each day. Those 15 minutes began with the distant, deep and drawn-out sound of a train whistle, a reminder that the outside world was still in motion. The townspeople, even those with no business there, habitually stood along the platform, not to wait for anyone but to watch, as if simply seeing the train roll by would reassure them that Dry Hollow hadn't been completely forgotten. That morning Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the platform, a sufficient distance from the crowd to avoid striking up a conversation. He wore an old, worn-brimmed hat, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of iron coal and dry dust, the smell of journeys that leave no one behind. Ethan didn't know exactly what he was waiting for. On paper, he was waiting for an ordinary woman. That's how the matchmaker had described her. A woman who would accept a practical marriage, come to Whinstone to share the rest of her days with him, ask few questions, dream few dreams. Ethan didn't expect love. He only wanted presence. Someone who could sit opposite him at dinner so that the silence wouldn't be so overwhelming. He looked toward the tracks where the train was slowing down. The grinding of the iron wheels on the rails produced a deafening sound, causing some in the crowd to instinctively cover their ears. When the train came to a complete stop, steam rose momentarily, obscuring the view like a stage curtain slowly rising. The first to disembark was a young man carrying an old suitcase, followed by a young couple, then a familiar street vendor. Ethan observed, unhurried. He didn't know what the woman looked like and wasn't sure he'd recognize her even if she stood right in front of him. Perhaps she'd look around, searching. Perhaps she'd be flustered or hesitant. Then, Margaret Hale stepped off the ship. She was in no hurry. She placed one foot down on the iron step, then the other, standing upright as if accustomed to all eyes being on her without needing to avoid them. She wore a neatly tailored, unadorned ash-gray coat, a long, clean skirt, sturdy, low-heeled shoes. A simple hat partially concealed her dark hair, which was neatly tied back. Nothing about her resembled Ethan's image of a mail-in bride. Margaret didn't look around, searching. She stood still for a few seconds, letting the steam dissipate, allowing the train station to become clearly visible. Her gaze was sharp but not cold. It was the gaze of someone accustomed to observing before acting, someone who didn't need to ask where they were because they already knew. Silence spread from that moment. The Dry Hollow crowd, accustomed to whispering about anything unusual, suddenly fell silent. No one sneered. No one uttered a sarcastic remark. They looked at Margaret Hale as if she were something that didn't fit into the old conventional molds they used to measure women. Ethan realized he was holding his breath. It wasn't because of her beauty. Though Margaret possessed a calm, mature beauty, it was because of her demeanor. She didn't appear to be someone seeking a place to stand. She stood there as if Dry Hollow were merely a stop, not the sole destination of her life. Margaret took a few more steps, set her suitcase down, and then looked up. Her gaze rested on Ethan. Not for long, just long enough. But in that brief moment, Ethan had the strange feeling that she was assessing not him but the situation. He advanced slowly. Each step seemed to carry its own weight. "Mrs. Hale?" Ethan asked, his voice low and uncertain. Margaret nodded. "Mr. Cole." Not a question, an affirmation. There were no hurried handshakes, no polite smiles. They stood facing each other in the middle of the platform in the late afternoon sun, like two strangers who understood they were entering into an agreement that neither intended to romanticize. Ethan noticed the crowd was watching them. He was used to that look, the look given to a man about to marry in an unconventional way. But today, the look carried a different nuance. It wasn't directed at him as much as he expected. It lingered on Margaret Hale. And Margaret did not bow her head. She stood upright, her hands resting lightly on the handles of her suitcase, as if that were the only anchor she needed. There was no sign of fear, no apparent overprotectiveness, just the composure of someone who knew who she was and didn't need Dry Hollow to confirm it. Ethan suddenly understood why the silence of the crowd was so heavy. Because Margaret Hale's presence directly challenged a prejudice that the town had never even begun to name, that a woman from outside arriving in this context should be weaker, should speak more softly. Margaret is not like that. As they left the train station, Ethan walked beside her, maintaining just the right distance. Not intrusive, but not neglectful either. He didn't know what to say, and for the first time in years he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. As they crossed the final boundary of the platform, Ethan heard the train whistle again, then slowly roll away. Dry Hollow returned to its familiar silence. But something had changed. It wasn't in the town. It was in the way. Ethan Cole took a deep breath, as if he'd just realized how long he'd forgotten to breathe. And just when Ethan thought the greatest challenge was simply getting Margaret Hale off the platform, the muffled laughter and sarcastic remarks about to come from behind him would force him to choose to bow his head like everyone else at Dry Hollow, or to stand tall for the first time in many years. Dry Hollow has no proper town square. There's just a main street slightly wider than the others, where the bank, police station, and old shops stand opposite each other like witnesses accustomed to silence. It is there that the town's most important stories often unfold. Without announcement, without fanfare, just enough people to gather. Ethan Cole and Margaret Hale had just turned off the train when they heard laughter. Not loud, not violent, just a laugh that lasted longer than necessary. Sheriff Roy Talbot leaned against the wooden post in front of the police station, his thumb hooked into his belt, his hat tilted to one side in a familiar pose. He didn't step out to block the street. No need. His presence there was enough to turn the street into a stage. "Well," Roy Talbot said, his voice drawn out, "Dry Hollow has a distinguished guest today." Some people stopped. Others pretended to be busy, but listened intently. News spread quickly in places where there was little to talk about. Ethan felt the gazes fixed upon him. He was used to it. The stares directed at a man about to lose his land, at a loser, taking his final steps in town. But today those stares were sharper because Margaret Hale stood beside him. "This is—" Roy paused, looking Margaret up and down, his assessment undisguised. "The new bride." The atmosphere froze. Margaret didn't answer. She just stood still, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if Roy Talbot wasn't worth her attention. Her silence left the question hanging in the air, uncomfortably so. Ethan felt his throat dry up. He knew this moment. He'd witnessed it many times with others. When the town decided to laugh and the person being laughed at had a choice, laugh along or bow their head and let it pass more quickly. Roy Talbot smirked. "I'm just curious. It's not every day that someone orders a wife by mail and then picks her up at the train station." A few soft giggles escaped. No one laughed loudly. No one wanted to be the first to show malice, but each small giggle added up to something heavy, like a cold mist clinging to the skin. Ethan looked down at his shoes. He could choose to remain silent. He could pull Margaret along. He could pretend not to hear. He had done that for years. Kept going. Endured. Hoped it would all work itself out. But this time something was different. Perhaps it was because Margaret Hale was standing there, straight-backed, not flinching. Perhaps it was because Ethan was too tired to keep bowing his head. Or perhaps it was because when one is about to lose everything, the fear of losing a little more honor is no longer enough to stop them. Ethan looked up. "What do you want, Roy?" he asked, his voice low but clear. The crowd fell silent. Roy Talbot blinked as if surprised that Ethan would respond. He was used to Ethan Cole's quiet, evasive demeanor, his quick movements, avoiding unnecessary conversations. "Just saying hello," Roy said, shrugging. "It's a small town. We care about each other." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then you've finished saying your goodbyes." A long silence ensued. No one spoke. The wind blew, stirring up dust that brushed against everyone's boots before dissipating. Roy Talbot smirked. "You're too sensitive, Cole. I thought you'd be happy to have someone interested in your private life." "Private matters," Ethan repeated, his voice even. "They should be kept private." Margaret glanced at him very quickly. Not with surprise, but with the look of someone who had just noted something important. Roy Talbot adjusted his posture. "You know this town isn't easy to live in, especially for those who choose an unconventional path." "You're right," Ethan replied. "Dry Hollow isn't an easy place to live. But it's never been a place where people get humiliated in the street." The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic, but they fell on the dry ground like a rare drop of water, enough for everyone to notice their sound. Some people turned away. Some bowed their heads. No one laughed anymore. Roy Talbot stared at Ethan for a long time. There was a hint of displeasure in his eyes, but also something else. A reluctant reassessment. "He's changed," Roy said. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked around at the familiar faces, people he'd shared coffee with, People who'd stood beside him in church. People who'd been silent when he needed a voice. "I'm just tired of bowing my head," Ethan said in the end. There was no applause. No words of praise. But there was a subtle shift in the air, like when the wind changes direction. Ethan turned to Margaret. "Let's go." She nodded. They walked slowly, unhurriedly. Behind them, Dry Hollow returned to its old rhythm of life, but not entirely the same. There were eyes following Ethan Cole. No longer just pity, but a mixture of reserved respect. Ethan sensed it. He didn't turn around. He didn't need confirmation. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole walked through town without feeling like he was asking permission to exist. And as they left Dry Hollow's sight, walking toward the road leading to Whinstone, Ethan still didn't know that the truly important conversation wouldn't take place in front of the crowd, but would begin in the old log cabin, where he and Margaret Hale would be forced to clarify what they wanted and what they hadn't promised each other. The house in Whinstone was smaller than Margaret Hale had imagined. It wasn't because it was cramped, but because it was built for two people but had been lived in by one for too long. Everything was neat in the way of a man accustomed to managing things himself. The wooden table was wiped clean. The kitchen was tidy. The chairs were neatly arranged, as if the owner were always preparing for a guest he wasn't sure would arrive. Ethan Cole set Margaret's suitcase down by the door, then stepped back. He didn't invite her to sit down immediately. Not out of impoliteness, but because he didn't know where to begin. The journey from Dry Hollow to Whinstone was long, but they had barely spoken. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a necessary buffer before an inevitable conversation. Margaret took off her gloves and placed them on the table. She looked around the house very slowly, as if reading a story written in wood, in dust, in the worn marks on the floor. She didn't comment. She simply observed. "Before we go any further," Margaret said, her voice calm, neither rising nor falling, "I think we need to clarify a few things." Ethan nodded. "I think so too." Margaret turned to look at him. Her gaze was neither soft nor harsh. It was the gaze of someone accustomed to speaking the truth even when it made others uncomfortable. "I didn't come here to be rescued," she said. The words weren't harsh, but they fell into the quiet room like an object carefully placed on a table, forcing the person facing them to look directly at them. Ethan didn't react immediately. He leaned slightly against the back of the chair, his arms crossed in front of his chest, not defensively, but to keep himself still. "I don't think so," he replied after a moment. "I never thought I could save anyone." Margaret nodded, as if that answer confirmed what she had already suspected. "Good. Then we're not starting from a misunderstanding." She sat down in the chair opposite the table, her back straight. "This marriage on paper may be necessary for both of us, but in reality I want it to be clear." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down opposite her. "Go ahead and speak." Margaret took a shallow breath. "I need Whinstone. Not a place to live, not a roof over one's head, but Whinstone." A name spoken clearly without hesitation. Ethan looked at her, his eyes reflecting something difficult to name. Not anger, not suspicion. Rather the alert vigilance of someone who had lost too much to remain naive. "What do you need it for?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, then around the house once more. "I need it like a partner needs a foundation," she said. "I don't intend to turn Whinstone into anything else. I just need it to exist." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You should know," he said, "I only have 7 days left." "I know." The answer came too quickly. Ethan realized that immediately. "You know?" he asked again. Margaret looked up. "I didn't come here unprepared." The atmosphere in the room changed. It was no longer a conversation between two strangers negotiating a convenient marriage. It became a dialogue between two people who understood that every word carried consequences. "Then you know I have nothing left to lose," Ethan said, his voice lower. Margaret looked him straight in the eye. "I know you still have your honor." That statement silenced Ethan. Honor. Something he had just defended on Dry Hollow's main street, something he never thought he would have to name. "Marriage on paper," Margaret continued, "is to meet the demands of this society. A partnership in reality is for both to survive." "And feelings?" Ethan asked, not sarcastically, just confirming. Margaret shook her head slightly. "That's not what I promised." Ethan nodded. "Me too." They sat there facing each other in the wooden house that had witnessed years of silence that spoke louder than words. There was no romance in that moment, but there was something else. A quiet respect between two people who didn't try to embellish their circumstances. You can refuse, Margaret added. I won't blame you. Ethan looked out the window where the late afternoon sun shone on the stationary water wheel. He thought of Anna. He thought of the days he had tried to do everything right. He thought of the bank letter lying in the pocket of his coat hanging in the corner of the room. If I agree, he said, then Whinstone will remain Whinstone. I'm not selling it. I'm not letting it be torn apart. Margaret nodded. I didn't come to separate. I came to keep. Ethan turned to look at her. And what if later, when it's all over? Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she said very softly but clearly, then we will be two free people who have done our part. No promises are made beyond what is necessary. No illusions. Only truth is laid bare, concise, and uncompromising. Ethan stood up, walked to the table, and extended his hand. Not to shake, but to confirm. Then he said, we are partners. Margaret stood up and placed her hand on his. The touch was brief, firm, and unwavering. As partners, she replied. Outside, the wind blew harder, whipping up dust from the dry ground. But inside the small house in Whinstone, something was taking shape. Not love, but an agreement honest enough that neither had to pretend. And this lack of pretense, though they may not yet realize it, will be the foundation for everything that follows. That night, as Margaret Hale began to open the old notebooks, and Ethan Cole looked at Whinstone with a different perspective, for the first time neither knew that what they were about to uncover was not just the cause of misery, but the traces of an injustice that had silently existed for years. Margaret Hale didn't wake up early out of habit. She woke up early because she couldn't sleep. It wasn't because the house was unfamiliar, nor because the wind was whistling through the cracks in the door. It was because some things from the previous day hadn't quite fit together in her mind. Margaret was used to that feeling. It was like when a story has a few inconsistencies. Not enough to draw a conclusion, but enough to make it impossible to ignore. She put on her coat and stepped outside before dawn. Whinstone in the early morning had a different appearance, quiet, bare, concealing nothing. Margaret walked slowly, observing everything as if reading a map not drawn with ink, but with the traces of time. She started with the water source. The stream west of Whinstone wasn't really a stream anymore. It was a low-lying strip of land curving along the terrain, where dried mud cracked into tiny channels like dried-up blood vessels. Margaret bent down and touched the soil. There was no moisture, no sign of water having flowed nearby. How long has it been? She asked as Ethan approached from behind. 3 years, he replied. About that. Margaret nodded. 3 years of drought weren't uncommon in this region. But she didn't stop there. She went upstream, following the old trail past the fence across the Whinstone boundary. Each step had a purpose, though Ethan didn't yet know what it was. They stopped at a higher point where the ground suddenly changed color. Margaret stood still, looking closely. Here, she said. Do you see it? Ethan looked in that direction. What did you see? Line break. She pointed to a trench dug in the ground, unnatural, not caused by rain. A mark of human intervention, old but clear. Margaret sighed softly. The water doesn't just disappear. It's been diverted. Ethan felt a strange sensation rise in his chest. Not hope, not anger. Rather the profound bewilderment of someone who for the first time doubted a story he had believed for years. But upstream, he said slowly, that's Whitmore's land. Margaret turned to look at him, not surprised. I know. They returned home when the sun was already high in the sky. Margaret didn't rest. She opened her suitcase, took out her notebook and pencil, and asked Ethan to bring out all the papers. He still had old contracts, tax receipts, bank loan documents, land maps. Ethan complied slowly. He had never looked at those papers this way before. To him they were obligations. Things to keep, not things to understand. Margaret was different. She read them as if they were a carefully concealed confession. She compared dates, checked numbers, and noted subtle changes, interest rates rising after each drought, land boundaries being subtly adjusted, and additional fees appearing without notice. Have you noticed, Margaret asked, that all of Whinstone's troubles began after Whitmore bought the land above? Ethan shook his head. I think it was just bad luck. Margaret put down her pen. Bad luck doesn't tend to repeat itself in the same pattern. She spread the map out on the table. Using a pencil, she traced the old waterway, then marked the plots of land that had changed hands. Gradually, an image emerged. Indistinct, but undeniable. Whinstone didn't fall because Ethan did something wrong. Whinstone fell because someone decided it should. Ethan sat down in a chair, his hands resting on his knees. He looked at the map, at the numbers, at the patience in Margaret Hale's every movement. A sentence escaped his lips very softly, as if he were afraid he himself would hear it. "So, I'm not poor." Margaret looked at him. "No. And I didn't fail because I was incompetent." "Are not." Ethan swallowed hard. "But that's because I was robbed." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She let Ethan say it himself, letting him confront the truth as if it were fire. "It takes time to process and courage to accept. He's not the only one," she said finally. "Just the next one." That statement broadened everything. Ethan suddenly thought of other farms. People who had left Dry Hollow in silence. Empty houses. The same stories told in different voices. For the first time his weariness took shape. It was no longer a personal burden. It was a link in a much longer chain. Ethan stood up, walked outside, and looked upstream. The sunlight shone on the distant land, a place he had once thought beyond his reach. Now he saw it closer. Not in distance, but in reality. Margaret stood beside him. "The truth doesn't give back water," she said, "but it gives you a reason to stop blaming yourself." Ethan nodded slowly. In that moment something profoundly changed within him. Not an outburst of anger. Rather, the clarity of mind of someone who understood he had been treated unfairly, and no longer accepted it as fate. The wind blew across Whinstone. The old water wheel still wouldn't turn, but Ethan Cole felt for the first time in years that the land beneath his feet wasn't entirely hopeless anymore. And while Ethan was still learning to name that truth, Margaret Hale knew it was time for her to reveal the deeper reason why she had pursued Whinstone for so many years. A past connected not only to the land but to a debt that had never been repaid. Night falls quickly in Whinstone. Not the noisy darkness of a town, but a gradual, slow-moving darkness like a blanket covering everything that remained of the day. Margaret Hale sat at a small wooden table, an oil lamp placed between them, its pale yellow light casting shadows on the walls, stretching and distorting everything around them. Ethan Cole was still glued to the maps and numbers. He looked at them as if a painting had been flipped over. The same scene, but with a completely different meaning. "There's something," Margaret said, her voice lower than usual, "that you need to know." Ethan looked up. He didn't ask. He just looked. After a long day of realizing he wasn't a failure, he understood that the truth rarely stops at a point that makes us feel comfortable. Margaret slowly closed the notebook. She wasn't in a hurry. She was never in a hurry when it came to saying things that couldn't be taken back. "I'm not just a woman looking for a marriage of convenience," she began. "And Whinstone isn't here by chance to be in my path." Ethan leaned back in his chair. He sensed a change in the atmosphere, like the calm before a storm. "I am a private federal investigator," Margaret said. The words were spoken calmly, without pride, without concealment, as if it were a truth that needed to be laid bare, nothing more, nothing less. Ethan blinked. Once, then again. "You work for the government?" he asked, not doubting, just confirming. "Not officially," Margaret replied. "I'm hired on a case-by-case basis. Cases where the system isn't fast enough or clean enough to handle it itself." Ethan was silent. He looked at Margaret Hale, the woman who had stood tall in the station, who had not bowed to Roy Talbot, who had read the ledgers as if pronouncing a verdict, and for the first time all the pieces fit together. "And Whitmore?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "That's my target." She rose, walked to the window, and gazed out at the darkness upstream. 8 years ago," she continued, "my father lost everything because of Caleb Whitmore." Ethan felt a slight pressure in his chest. He was an accountant for a small railroad company. Margaret recounted, her voice even and unwavering. "He uncovered the fraud, the money being channeled through intermediary banks. Whitmore was behind it." She turned around, the oil lamp light illuminating half her face. "My father did the right thing. He reported it." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew the outcome before Margaret continued. "Whitmore doesn't need guns," she said. "He just needs papers. The company went bankrupt. Margaret's father was falsely accused of embezzlement. His reputation was ruined. No one would hire him anymore. 2 years later he died quietly, taking with him a truth that had never been proven. I've been following Whitmore ever since," Margaret said. 8 years. Across 3 states. Across dozens of plots of land. Towns like Dry Hollow. Ethan looked down at his hands. They rested on the table, rough, accustomed to labor. the hands of a man who had come to believe that fate was simply a series of struggles followed by acceptance. "So," he said slowly, "you already knew Whinstone." Margaret nodded. "I knew the stream would dry up. I knew the debt would come. I knew he wouldn't run away." Ethan chuckled softly, not happy, not angry, just a brief sound like a breath escaping his lips. "She took advantage of me," he said. Margaret didn't deny it. She stood still, letting the statement linger in the room without avoiding it. "Yes," she replied, "but I'm not lying to you." Ethan looked up. His eyes were sharper, not with anger, but with pain. "She came to me," he said, "because I was part of the plan." Margaret nodded again. "And because he's the right person. Is it appropriate to lose everything?" "It's appropriate to stand still," she said. "It's appropriate not to bow your head." The atmosphere became heavy. Ethan stood up, walked a few steps, then stopped by the table. He recalled every moment from the train station, from the main street, from the dry stream. Everything suddenly took on a different meaning. "Did you ever think," he asked, turning his back, "that I would refuse when I knew the truth?" Margaret answered without hesitation, "Yes." And she still came. "Because if I hadn't come," she said slowly, "Whitmore would have continued, and Whinstone would have disappeared like so many other places." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He felt the anger rising, but it didn't erupt. It was quiet, deep, like the last trickle of groundwater still flowing beneath dry earth. "She's been watching him for 8 years, Ethan said. "So why me?" Margaret looked him straight in the eye. "Because you weren't an accomplice, and because you did everything right, yet you were crushed. Stories like that make it impossible to ignore the truth." Ethan was silent for a long time. When he opened his eyes, his gaze was different. No longer the resigned man, nor the enraged one, but the man standing at a crossroads of no return. "So," he said, his voice hoarse, "what do you need from me next?" Margaret exhaled. It was the breath she had held since she began speaking. "I need you to decide," she replied. "Now you know the truth. I won't drag you along if you don't want to." Ethan looked back at Whinstone through the window. Darkness enveloped the farm, but in his mind everything was clearer than ever. Not because of hope, but because he had stopped blaming himself. And in that moment of silence, when the truth had been laid bare between them, Ethan Cole understood that the hardest thing wasn't being deceived, but deciding what to do with that truth. When dawn broke, mornings in Whinstone arrive in silence. There were no birds chirping, no sound of flowing water, only a gentle breeze sweeping across the dry prairie, carrying the last vestiges of the season's chill, a reminder that the long night that had just passed was not truly over in Ethan Cole's heart. He woke up earlier than usual, not because he was used to it, but because his anger wouldn't allow him to sleep in. Ethan stood on the porch, his hands resting on the wooden railing worn by years. Before him, Whinstone unfolded in a painfully familiar way. The water wheels stood still, the livestock sheds were sparse, and the plowed fields now bore only faint traces. This was the place he had spent his life preserving. Not out of ambition, but with the quiet perseverance of a man who believed that doing what was right was enough. And yet, "She took advantage of me." Those words echoed in Ethan's head, repeating like a steady tapping on wood. He had said them last night, not loudly but sharply. Not to hurt Margaret Hale, but so that he himself could hear the truth called out. Ethan wasn't one to get angry easily. His anger didn't erupt like a straw fire. It built up heavy and slow, like water held back for too long behind an invisible dam. Last night, when the truth about Margaret was revealed, that dam finally shook. He was being watched. He was being chosen. He was being drawn into a larger story without his knowledge. Ethan saw himself as a piece of Whinstone, judged, calculated, and considered part of someone else's plan. He went back inside. Margaret was sitting at the table, the morning light slanting through the window, illuminating her face. She wasn't holding a notebook. She wasn't writing. She was just sitting there waiting. "He's angry," Margaret said without asking. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He pulled up a chair, sat down opposite, and placed his hands on the table. The cool wood under his palms was enough to keep him alert. "No," he said after a moment. "I'm angry." Margaret nodded. "You have the right." 8 years, Ethan continued, his voice low and even, but beneath it a powerful undercurrent. 8 years you watched Whitmore. And in all that time you watched people like me lose everything, without saying a word. Margaret didn't shy away. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness." Ethan looked at her. "So what did you come here for?" "To conclude," Margaret replied. A long silence followed. The wind outside picked up again, gently tapping against the window as if someone were waiting for an answer. Ethan stood up and walked to the back of the house. He needed space. He needed to see Whinstone with his own eyes, not through a map, not through a plan, not through someone else's goals. He walked along the fence, stopping at the dry stream bed. Bending down, he picked up a small stone and threw it into the dry ground. There was no sound of water, only a dry, sharp, distinct thud. If I do nothing, Ethan thought, then everything will end here. It's not just about Whinstone. It's about how he looks back on his life. Ethan realized that what hurt him most wasn't being exploited, but the possibility that he would again choose to do nothing as he had done for years. Endure, wait, and hope someone else would see and correct the injustice. He once believed that silence was a virtue, that endurance was strength. But now, faced with the harsh reality, Ethan Cole understands that silence can also be a form of complicity. He returned home. Margaret was still there. She stood up when she saw him without speaking immediately. "You're right about one thing," Ethan said, his voice now different, no longer sharp but firm. "If I didn't act, Whinstone would disappear, and it would repeat itself elsewhere with someone else." Margaret looked at him, her gaze softening but not triumphant. "I don't expect you to make this decision because of me." "I know," Ethan replied. "I made the decision for myself." He walked closer to the table and placed his hand on the papers. "You have a plan." "I don't need to know everything right now." Margaret remained silent, waiting. Ethan looked up. His eyes were no longer those of someone cornered. They were the eyes of someone who had chosen to stand rather than turn away. Then he said slowly, clearly, word by word, "Tell me what I should do." That statement wasn't a declaration of war, not a heroic promise. It was the words of a man who had lived long enough to understand that maturity lies not in avoiding conflict but in accepting responsibility when the truth is revealed. Margaret breathed a sigh of relief, not because the plan had succeeded, but because Ethan Cole had made his own choice. "I need you to stand firm," she said, "and when necessary to stand in front of others." Ethan nodded. "I've bowed enough." Outside, the sun had risen higher, shining directly on Whinstone. It didn't crack the earth to release water. It didn't repair the windmill, but it illuminated something very important. The change had begun within people before any action took place. Ethan Cole stands in the middle of his ranch, no longer the man on the brink. He is the man who has just crossed it. Not by force, but by the sensible choice of someone who understands there is something worth protecting. And when Ethan Cole announced that decision, both he and Margaret Hale understood that Whitmore wouldn't stand idly by. Because there are those who, when they feel their power is threatened, will choose to burn everything down before it falls into someone else's hands. Nights in Whinstone are usually very quiet. It wasn't the kind of peaceful, sleep-inducing tranquility, but the vast silence of the prairie, where every sound had room to resonate, where even the slightest noise could startle. Ethan Cole had grown accustomed to it over the years, but tonight that silence felt different, as if the earth and sky were holding their breath. Margaret Hale couldn't sleep. She sat at the table, the oil lamp lowered its light, illuminating only what was necessary. Not books, not maps. She simply listened. Her ears had been trained to detect anything unusual, even on the most seemingly harmless nights. Ethan lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the dark wooden ceiling. He couldn't sleep. After his morning decision, sleep wasn't coming easily. But unlike Margaret, Ethan couldn't name the feeling weighing on his chest. It wasn't exactly fear. Rather, it was a very clear awareness that he had crossed a boundary. Around midnight, Margaret got up. "Ethan," she whispered. He was already awake. "What's wrong? We will not be left in peace." Ethan sat up. "Do you think Whitmore will intervene?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window and parted the curtains slightly. Outside, the wind had changed direction. A strange smell wafted through the air. Not the usual smell of hay. "No need to think about it," she said. "I've been waiting." Ethan stood up and put on his coat. He didn't ask any further questions. From the moment he said, "Then tell me what I have to do," he understood that the next steps wouldn't be easy. Then the smell of smoke came. At first it was faint, as if someone were burning trash in the distance, but in just a few breaths it became clearer, spicier, thicker. Margaret opened the back door. The flames reflected against the night sky, a flickering, unmistakable orange red. The east barn. Ethan said, his voice hoarse. They ran. The fire had caught the dry wood, rising quickly and relentlessly. The flames didn't roar. They did their work in a terrifying silence, like someone who knew there was no need to rush. Ethan grabbed a bucket of water, but he knew it was hopeless. There wasn't enough water. There wasn't time. Margaret pulled his hand back. Don't. Cattle. They've been released, she said quickly. I opened the cage first. Ethan looked at her for a brief moment where he realized that Margaret Hale had thought of this even before the fire broke out. A noise came from the fence. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't broken wood. Margaret paused, placing her hand on Ethan's arm. It's not just fire. Two figures emerged from the shadows, moving slowly and deliberately. The firelight illuminated their faces for a moment, enough for Ethan to recognize the familiar features of those who did not belong to Whinstone, who did not belong to Dry Hollow. Two gunmen. They didn't look like drunkards or hot-tempered people. They walked like hired workers, getting a job done and nothing more. Ethan felt his heart pounding, but his mind was strangely clear. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't even reach for it. Margaret was different. She took half a step forward, positioning herself slightly toward Ethan, as if that were the position she had chosen long ago. I guessed right, she said, her voice loud enough for the other two to hear. One of the gunmen chuckled softly. You're guessing a lot, aren't you? That's enough to know. Whitmore doesn't like leaving things unfinished, Margaret replied. We're just here to check, the other man said, his voice even. This farm has had an accident. People are panicking. They might do something reckless. Ethan recognized the way they spoke. No direct threats. Not necessary. They spoke as if everything had already been decided, only a final period was missing. You're late, Margaret said. The two gunmen stared at her. The firelight reflected in their eyes. We arrived just in time, one person replied. The fire is doing its job. Margaret shook her head slightly. The fire is just a signal. Ethan looked at her. He didn't fully understand, but he trusted her voice. The voice of someone who would never bet, without knowing all the cards. Whitmore thought that if he burned Whinstone, Margaret continued, everything would go back to how it was. But he forgot one thing. What, one of the gunmen asked. Margaret looked straight at them. There are people who, when pushed to the brink, have nothing left to lose but the truth. A long silence followed. The fire crackled in the background, the wind grew stronger, whipping up ash like black snow. The two gunmen exchanged glances. Not hesitation, but consideration. Finally, one of them shrugged. We're just following orders, and that order, Margaret said, will become very expensive. Ethan didn't know why, but in that moment he understood that this confrontation wasn't over yet. It was just a warning in the form of fire. The two gunmen retreated one step at a time without turning their backs immediately. Then they disappeared into the darkness just as they had arrived. Ethan stood still for a long time afterward. The fire finally died down, leaving behind charred wooden frames, and the smell of smoke clung to the air. Whinstone was injured, but not dead. Ethan turned to Margaret. The firelight illuminated her face, highlighting the tired lines he hadn't noticed during the day. You already know, he said, not reproachfully. It was an affirmation. Margaret nodded. Whitmore won't wait long. Ethan looked at the ashes. A part of his past had burned to ashes in the night, but strangely he didn't feel empty. He felt clear. Then Ethan said, his voice low but firm, we have no way back. Margaret looked at him. I never thought that was the case. The wind blew through Whinstone, carrying ashes and scattering them across the dry earth. That night, amidst the smell of smoke and burning wood, one thing was etched in my mind. The game had begun, and it was no longer about keeping a farm. It was about who would face the truth when dawn broke. And as the first rays of morning light shone upon the remnants of Whinstone, Ethan Cole understood that the next time Whitmore struck, it wouldn't just be fire. It would be a confrontation that would force him and Margaret Hale to use everything they had prepared to defend themselves. Sunrise in Whinstone doesn't come with a dazzling light. It arrived in faint gray streaks creeping across the prairie, illuminating the remnants of the fire. Charred wooden frames, the lingering smell of smoke, and dark patches of earth where embers had yet to dissipate. Ethan Cole stood still for a long time, gazing at his farm as if it were a loved one who had narrowly escaped death. He felt no outburst of anger. He felt concentration. Margaret Hale had been there before him. She didn't say much. She simply pointed out the things Ethan needed to know: the direction of the morning wind, the less noticed trail, and the entrance to the old mine shaft on the hillside, which had once been used to store explosives when Whinstone was still quarrying stone. "We're not going to have a gunfight," Margaret said, her voice low. "We're going to finish this before it starts." Ethan nodded. He understood. Guns were what Whitmore was hoping for. Guns create chaos, and chaos always benefits those who are skilled at manipulation. They moved at a slow pace. No running, no hurry. Ethan carried his old gun, but it lay still in its holster, a final reminder rather than a first choice. Margaret led the way, surveying the terrain with eyes accustomed to chases without gunfire. From the hilltop they saw two figures appear at the edge of Whinstone. No concealment, no stealth. The two gunmen advanced like hired hands on a well-known mission. They split into groups, keeping their distance. A sign of experience. "The wind has changed," Margaret said softly. "From west to east." Ethan watched intently. If there was an explosion, the sound would bounce back toward the hill, enough to make anyone standing in the wrong spot pay the price. They descended into the old mine shaft. The entrance was low, its mouth crumbling over the years. Inside, the smell of damp earth mingled with the scent of old metal. Margaret lit a small lamp, just enough light to see the sealed barrels of mine explosives. Old, but still usable if used correctly. "We just need sound," she said. "We don't need fire." Ethan placed his hand on the wooden barrel, feeling the rough surface. He remembered the old days when Whinstone was more populated, when dynamite was used to clear paths, not to drive away others. For the first time he realized the thin line between construction and destruction. And the responsibility lay in the hands of those who chose how to use it. Margaret set everything up quickly, short wires strategically placed to direct the sound waves, and a detonation point far from the main house. Everything had a purpose, not a single wasted movement. "Ethan," she said, looking directly at him. "If they retreat, we stop." He nodded. "Stop." The two gunmen moved closer. They stopped when they heard the first echo from the bunker. Not loud, but strange. A dry, reverberating sound like stones falling into the ground. They looked at each other, wary. Margaret gestured. Ethan detonated the explosives. The sound wasn't explosive. It was a thud. A deep, reverberating thud that bounced off the hillside and back down, causing the ground to tremble slightly. Dust and rocks fell like a fine rain, enough to disorient anyone unprepared. The two gunmen instinctively recoiled. They raised their guns, but there was no target. No one came out. No return fire. Only a deafening silence. Margaret triggered it a second time. Out of sync, in a different direction. This sound lasted longer, creeping across the prairie, making it difficult for the listener to pinpoint its source. One of the gunmen cursed. They began to realize they were no longer in control of the situation. Ethan emerged from the edge of the hill, revealing himself purposefully. He stood straight, his gun unpointed. He just stood there like a landmark. "Leave Whinstone," he said, his voice just loud enough. "Right now." One of the gunmen chuckled dryly. "You think those noises?" The third sound hit. Not close. Not far. Just the right distance to remind me. Margaret appeared opposite, forming a pincer movement. She said nothing. Her gaze did the rest. The two gunmen exchanged glances. Not out of fear. It was assessment. They understood that each next step would only make things worse for them, not better for their employer. "Whitmore paid in full," one person said. "Not enough," Ethan replied, "and it will never be enough." A long silence ensued. The wind carried the scent of ashes. One gunman lowered his weapon first, then the other. They retreated slowly without turning their backs abruptly. No one fired. No one pursued. As they disappeared behind the hill, Margaret breathed a sigh of relief, the first since dawn. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding but his mind clear. He saw no victory. He saw the lines redrawn. They quickly checked the area. No pursuit. No new fire. Margaret extinguished the fuse, cleaning up the evidence. Not to hide, but to avoid provoking. Ethan helped her, his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the receding adrenaline. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked. Ethan nodded. "I've never done this before." "He did the right thing," she said. "He stopped at the right time." They returned to the main house. Daylight had risen high enough to clearly see the damage, and what remained intact. Winstone was wounded but stood firm. Ethan placed his hand on the charred doorframe, feeling the wood warm in the sun. For the first time, he didn't see himself as a helpless caretaker. He saw himself as a protector. "Whitmore won't stop," Ethan said. Margaret shook her head. "He'll change his tactics." Ethan looked at her. "And so do we." There were no heroic promises, no grand pronouncements, only a silent understanding between two people who crossed the line of violence without letting it consume them. As evening fell, the wind subsided. The ashes settled. Winstone breathed a sigh of relief like a body recovering from a fever. Ethan sat on the steps, watching the sunlight slide across the prairie. He realized something simple and profound. For the first time, he was fighting not to prove anything but to retain what had belonged to him from the beginning. And as the last echo faded into the earth, Margaret Hale knew it was time to open the trunk she had carried throughout her journey. Not to retrieve clothes, but to lay on the table the evidence powerful enough to bring down an empire built on fear. The evening in Winstone became quieter after the day's tension. No more strange noises, no more signs of a stalker. Only a gentle breeze rustling the smoldering burn marks and the oil lamp casting shadows of two people sitting opposite each other at their familiar wooden table. Ethan Cole felt tired, not physically tired, but the kind of fatigue that comes after the adrenaline wears off, leaving behind a naked alertness. He poured some water, placed the glass in front of Margaret Hale, then sat down silently watching her open the trunk she had brought with her on her first day in Winstone. The trunk wasn't large. Dark wood, a scratched brass lock just like the trunks people used to carry clothes on long journeys. Ethan had thought it contained dresses, personal belongings, the small things of a life of constant travel. Margaret unlocked it. No fabrics, no mementos, only papers. She took them out one by one, arranging them neatly on the table as if rearranging a courtroom that had never been opened. Thick ledgers, frayed edges, contracts with forged seals, handwritten lists, names of people, bank names, amounts, dates. Ethan watched his heart slowing down, becoming heavier. "This is all I've collected in 8 years," Margaret said. Her voice was even not boastful. "Not everything, but enough." She opened a notebook and flipped to a marked page. "This amount," she pointed. The money went through 3 intermediary banks. Finally, it came back to Whitmore in the form of land investment. Ethan looked at the numbers. He wasn't as good at reading ledgers as Margaret, but he understood enough to know that these numbers couldn't have come about without collusion. A list of bribes. Margaret continued, opening another stack of papers. Local officials, land appraisers, police. Not everyone knew the whole story, but everyone got their share. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Faces flashed through his mind. Familiar, with whom he had shaken hands with, whom he had spoken in church. He didn't feel intense anger. He felt sadness. A mature, quiet sadness, like realizing something has existed too long to be shocking anymore. "So," Ethan said softly, "it's not just Winstone." Margaret shook her head. "It's never just one place." She folded the papers slowly. "If we take this to federal court, Whitmore will be investigated. He might be arrested, but he'll drag a lot of people down with him. And this town," she paused, choosing her words, "will be shut down." Ethan opened his eyes. "Close, like many other towns," Margaret said. "When the truth comes from the outside, no one stays long enough to mend what's broken." Ethan looked around the log cabin. Winstone had been threatened enough. So had Dry Hollow. He didn't want justice to come like a storm, sweeping everything away and leaving empty land for others to claim. "So just having the paperwork isn't enough," he said. Margaret looked at him, a fleeting look of approval in her eyes. "Exactly." She took out the last volume, thinner, but heavy in a different way. "The testimony," she said. "Not mine." Ethan flipped through the pages. He recognized the handwriting of those who had left town. Unpolished narratives, approximate figures, losses that could never be compensated. "But they're not here," Ethan said. "No," Margaret replied, "but there are people like them." She folded the papers. Whitmore was strong because people thought he was alone, because everyone believed his story was unique. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He thought about the stairs on the main street, about the people who had remained silent when he was mocked. He was beginning to understand that the real climax of this confrontation didn't lie in the mines or the explosives. We need them, Ethan said. We need the town. Margaret nodded. The truth needs to be told to those who have lived with it. A moment of silence passed. The oil lamp burned faintly and steadily. Outside, the wind subsided as if the earth and sky were listening. And me, Ethan asked. What is my role? Margaret looked at him for a long time. He is a man who cannot be dismissed. A man who has lost enough to no longer fear losing more. A man whom Whitmore thought was broken. Ethan gave a wry smile. He's mistaken. No, Margaret said. He never saw him as a human being. Just as a piece of land. Ethan bent down, placing his hands on the edge of the table. He pondered the biggest question of his life. If the truth were told, where would he stand? I'm not a good speaker, he said. Margaret shook her head. You don't need to say much. Just stand there, in the right place. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood. What people like Whitmore feared most wasn't evidence, but the breaking of their silence before the public. Margaret put the papers back in the trunk and locked it carefully. We need a place, she said. A place where people can't leave. Ethan looked up. The church. Margaret smiled very slightly. You understand. That night, they didn't say much more. There was no need. Everything was in place. Not as a perfect plan, but as a clear path. A path that once stepped onto could not be turned back upon. Ethan Cole looked at the closed trunk. He noticed something strange. For years he had lived surrounded by paperwork. Bills, debts, contracts. But he had never felt them carry such weight as they did now. Not because they could destroy one person, but because they could free many others from their loneliness. And as night fell on Whinstone, Ethan Cole understood that the next step wouldn't take place in the shadows or behind someone else's back, but right in the heart of Dry Hollow, where the truth once spoken would force the entire town to choose sides. That morning, Ethan Cole wore his oldest jacket. Not because it was warmer, but because it perfectly embodied the appearance of a man who had reached the end of his road. The burn marks on his sleeves still smelled of smoke. His collar was frayed. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low enough to conceal the eyes Ethan didn't want anyone to see too closely. He rode his horse into Dry Hollow just as the town was waking up. There was nothing unusual about the scene. The old shop was open late as usual. The church was still silent, the bell tower not yet chiming. Familiar faces stood on the porch holding cups of coffee, watching Ethan pass by with eyes all too familiar with the image of a loser. Ethan didn't shy away from that gaze. He let it fall on him like dust without resistance. Caleb Whitmore's bank office remains the most solid building on Main Street. Red brick, clean glass windows, brightly colored signage. A reminder that some things never burn, never waver. Ethan walked in. The doorbell rang softly, politely, to the point of being cold. Whitmore looked up from behind his desk, his small eyes narrowing for a moment as he recognized who stood before him. Then he smiled, the smile of someone who had long awaited this outcome. Cole, Whitmore said, his voice low, just loud enough to be heard. I hear Whinstone has been in an accident. Ethan nodded. He didn't sit down. He stood there, his hands gripping the brim of his hat as if letting go would cause everything to collapse. I've come to ask for an extension, Ethan said. No beating around the bush. No explanations. No justifications. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together. Extension, he repeated. After everything that's happened, Ethan bowed his head. Not too low, just enough to show his weariness. I need more time. Whitmore observed him for a long time. There was no pity in his eyes, only the satisfaction of someone accustomed to watching others fall little by little. He knows the rules, Whitmore said. Debt is debt. I know, Ethan replied, but Whinstone is all I have. Whitmore chuckled softly. That's the problem. He rose, walked away from the table, and circled Ethan as if inspecting a piece of merchandise about to become his. I can give you a few more days, he said, lowering his voice. But it's not free. Ethan didn't ask the price. He already knew. Sign here, Whitmore said, placing a piece of paper on the table. Transferring the right to use the western portion of the land. Only temporarily. Ethan looked at the paper. At the blank signature. At the familiar trap wrapped in polite words. He took a deep breath. If I sign, he said, what will be left of Whinstone? Whitmore shrugged. Enough to live out the rest of his life. Ethan nodded slowly. That's enough. Whitmore handed over the pen. Ethan took it. His hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from acting. He signed. The signature was slightly crooked. Enough for Whitmore to believe that this man was truly exhausted. "Wise," Whitmore said, putting the paper away. "You should have learned this sooner." Ethan put his hat back on and turned around. Before leaving the door, he paused. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked up. "What else?" "Thank you," Ethan said. Whitmore laughed even louder. "Nothing." Ethan stepped outside and the doorbell rang softly again. Dry Hollow Main Street greeted him with faint sunlight. No one knew what had just happened in that office. And that was exactly what was necessary. While Ethan plays the role of a failure, Margaret Hale is forging different paths. She didn't go to see Whitmore. She went to see someone from Dry Hollow. Not a meeting, not a call to action. Just small conversations in the right place at the right time. On the porch. In the barn. After prayer. Margaret didn't bring papers. She brought questions. "Do you remember when the first water outage occurred? Have you ever seen your land contract altered without explanation? Have you ever thought that this might only happen to you?" Margaret listened more than she spoke. She let them piece together their memories. And when those pieces began to resemble each other eerily, she would simply say, "Tonight, at the church, if you want to hear the truth. No pressure, no promises. It's just an invitation." The Dry Hollow church lit up earlier than usual that evening. The bell didn't ring. It didn't need to. People still came. One by one. First the older people accustomed to not missing those rare evenings when something unusual happened. Then the younger, curious ones. No one knew exactly why they were there. They only knew that something was waiting. Ethan was sitting in the back row. He didn't stand up. He didn't speak to anyone. His gaze was fixed on the empty wooden platform in front of him where the pastor usually stood. Today it was empty. Deliberately. Margaret stood by the side of the church near the window. She watched the crowd grow. Familiar faces. Unfamiliar faces. Faces that had bowed their heads when Whitmore passed by. When everything had settled down, Margaret took a step forward. Not onto a platform. Just enough for everyone to see her. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the quiet space each word was clear. "We didn't gather to accuse," she continued. "We gathered to remember." A few people shifted in their seats. The atmosphere grew tense slowly like a taut string. Margaret looked towards Ethan. He nodded very slightly. "The trap has been set. Not by fire, not by guns, but by people." And as the church doors closed after the last latecomer, Dry Hollow was no longer a disjointed crowd but a community about to face the truth. Each number, each name. Read aloud where no one could turn away or pretend not to hear. The Dry Hollow church had never been as crowded as it was that night. Not for a grand celebration, nor for any calamity. People arrived in silence, bringing wooden chairs from home, standing along the walls once the main pews were full. No one laughed or spoke. No one asked questions. In the simple space of the church, the sound of shoes lightly treading on the wooden floor echoed clearly like an admission. Ethan Cole was still sitting in the back row. He didn't want to stand up. Not out of fear, but because tonight wasn't his night. He was just one of many who had lived long enough to believe their story was unique, until they realized it was exactly like someone else's. Margaret Hale stood near the platform but did not step onto it. She left that distance as a reminder that truth doesn't need a high position to carry weight. Caleb Whitmore arrived late. He entered when the church was already full, his dark coat neatly pressed, his demeanor the composure of someone accustomed to having all eyes averting their gaze. A few turned. No one greeted him. No one rose. Whitmore chose a seat near the aisle, sat down, his eyes scanning the room as if checking something still under his control. Margaret waited until the church doors closed. Then she spoke up. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice not loud but clear. "I won't speak long. I'll just read." She opened her slim briefcase and took out the first stack of papers. "Harlan Price family," Margaret read. In the first year after selling the upstream land to Whitmore's intermediary company, the well water level dropped 30%. In the second year, the bank raised interest rates because of environmental risks. A soft gasp came from the middle row of seats. Margaret didn't look up. She continued reading. Miriam Knox family. Land contract amended on page 4, line 12. Appraisal fees doubled after failure to renew with Whitmore Bank. Some people began to bow their heads. Some clenched their fists. Samuel Rowe family. Loan called early. Reason: devaluation of land. Time: 3 months after the water was diverted from the old stream. The names continued to be called out. Not fast, not frantic, but slow, steady, and unavoidable. Each number is a clean cut. Each date is a milestone that the listener begins to remember, remembering the moment they blamed themselves for thinking they were the only one experiencing bad luck. Ethan Cole closed his eyes for a moment. He heard whispers around him, not words of protest, but whispers of recognition. That very day. Me too. I thought it was just my house. Margaret stopped. She looked up for the first time. What I just read, she said, is not an isolated crime. It's a pattern. She turned toward Whitmore. Caleb Whitmore, she said, calling him by his first name. You built your power by making everyone in this room believe they were alone. Whitmore gave a wry smile. The numbers can be interpreted, he said. You're getting worked up. Margaret nodded slightly. Then let's continue reading. She took out a second stack of papers. A list of transfers, she said. Date, amount, recipient. She read each line aloud. No one shouted. No one pushed their chair back or stood up. But the atmosphere in the church changed. Those who had avoided Whitmore's gaze now looked him straight in the eye. Those who had been silent now sat with straighter backs. Not because anger had erupted, but because fear had lost its footing. Whitmore shifted in his chair. For the first time since entering, he no longer looked relaxed. His gaze no longer swept the room, but lingered, calculating. Margaret folded the paper. His power, she said, only exists when everyone is silent. She made no further accusations. No need. Ethan Cole stood up. No one looked at him immediately, but as he took a step, space opened up naturally. He didn't walk toward Whitmore. He walked into the middle of the aisle, standing there where all eyes converged. I thought I had failed, Ethan said. His voice was low and steady. I thought Winstone had fallen because I hadn't done well enough. He paused, looking around. It turns out I'm just one of many people who were treated the same way. A few heads nodded slightly. I'm not saying this to reclaim the land, Ethan continued. I'm saying it so we don't have to bow our heads anymore. Whitmore jumped to his feet. You're making a fool of yourself, he said. There's no legal evidence, Margaret interrupted. There will be. Not big. Not threatening. It's simply a fact that's been presented at the right time. Whitmore looked around. No one avoided his gaze anymore. No one sided with him. Those who had once depended on his bank now looked at him as if he were a stranger, stripped of his familiar facade. In that moment, Caleb Whitmore's power crumbled. Not by handcuffs, not by gunshots, but by the fact that no one believed him anymore. He sat down, not because he was forced, but because there was no more room to stand. The church fell silent. It wasn't a silence of fear. It was the silence of liberation, when what had been hidden was finally named. Margaret closed the folder. What happens next, she said, won't be easy, but it will be ours. No one applauded. It wasn't necessary. People began to stand up one by one, not hurried, not chaotic. They walked out of the church with a different air, slower, but more upright. Ethan Cole stayed until the very end. He looked up at the old bell tower. For the first time in years, he no longer felt that this town was a trap. And as night fell on Dry Hollow, the truth did what no fire or gun could do. It forced power to retreat in silence so that justice could arrive slowly but irreversibly. The next morning, Dry Hollow woke up as usual. There were no alarm bells, no crowds gathered, no rumors spreading from porch to porch. The sky was clear, the wind gentle, and the main road was still covered in the familiar dust of years past. But for those who had been in the church last night, the atmosphere was different. As if a heavy curtain had been drawn aside, allowing light to shine on things that had always been there. Ethan Cole stood outside his small inn on Main Street, sipping a cup of cold coffee. He wasn't in a hurry to return to Winstone. He felt the need to stay, not to wait for anything to happen, but to witness. After years of being swept along by the decisions of others, Ethan wanted this time to stand still and observe. Around mid-morning, 2 strange horse-drawn carriages appeared from the east. They carried no flags. There was no escort. Just two dark-colored cars, their wheels rolling slowly, stopping in front of Caleb Whitmore's bank office. The doors opened. 3 men stepped out, neatly dressed in neutral, understated attire. One carried a briefcase. Another looked around, taking everything in. The third stood slightly back, as if accustomed to not needing to be in the center of attention. Ethan recognized him immediately. A federal agent. No one in town cried out. No one ran to see. But doors creaked open. Eyes followed. Not out of curiosity, but out of a quiet sense of confirmation. What had been said last night was beginning to take shape. The bank doors opened. Caleb Whitmore appeared impeccably dressed, his hair neatly combed, his gait still as confident as ever. But something was gone. Not the power on paper, but the certainty in his eyes. He no longer looked at people as mere numbers. The agent spoke, his voice calm, loud enough to be heard. "Mr. Caleb Whitmore." "Yes," Whitmore replied. He was asked to cooperate in a federal investigation into financial fraud, land manipulation, and bribing local officials. No lengthy indictment readings. No explanations. Just one sentence, concise and powerful. Whitmore chuckled softly. "I have a lawyer." "You have the right to call," the agent said. "But for now, please follow us." No one pushed or shoved. No one shouted. The entire main street seemed to share the same rhythm. When the handcuffs closed around Whitmore's wrists, there was no loud metallic clang, just a small, very faint sound. But to those standing there, it echoed further than any gunshot that had ever been fired at Dry Hollow. Whitmore offered no resistance. There was no need. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces. Those who had bowed their heads, signed papers, remained silent. No one turned away. But no one showed any sign of triumph either. He was put into the car. The door closed. The wheels rolled away. Everything happened in less than 10 minutes. And then the town was quiet again. Ethan exhaled slowly. He felt no triumph. No sense of victory. Only a profound relief, like putting down a heavy burden he had carried for too long. As Ethan turned to leave, he saw Sheriff Roy Talbot standing in front of the police station. Roy looked older overnight. His shoulders slumped. His gaze was no longer evasive, but it was no longer rigid either. He stood there for a long time, looking toward the road where Whitmore's car had disappeared. Then very slowly, Roy Talbot removed the badge from his shirt. He gazed at it in his hand, the metal that once represented power, order, and trust. Then he placed it neatly on the office doorstep, as if returning an item he had borrowed too long ago. No one asked him to do it. No one accused him on the spot. But Roy understood, and that understanding was more important than any accusation. Ethan watched the scene, feeling a sense of closure. Not because everyone was forgiven, but because the pretense had ended. Margaret Hale stood at the edge of the street, not moving forward. She hadn't come to see the handcuffs. She had come to ensure that everything proceeded properly. No chaos, no bloodshed, no one becoming a scapegoat for the mob's anger. Ethan walked closer to her. "It's done." Margaret nodded. The first step. They gazed together at Dry Hollow. The old, dilapidated town once called a trap. Now it was still poor, still dry. But it was no longer locked away by fear. "Will you come?" Ethan asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked at the church, the empty bank, the road leading out of town. "Not today." Ethan nodded. He understood. There were things that needed to be done, but there was no need to rush. The afternoon faded slowly in Dry Hollow. The wind grew cooler. A few people began to gather in front of the church, not to gossip, but to sit together. Small conversations began. Not about Whitmore, but about the land, the water, about what could be done again. Ethan rode his horse away from the main street as the sun was about to set. He didn't look back. There was no need. He had seen enough of what he needed to see. The road to Whinstone was long but less strenuous than before. And as the sun set over Dry Hollow, Ethan Cole knew that justice had done its part in silence. And now it was up to the people to learn to live on, rebuild, and board trains that no longer carried fear, but a slow, yet very real hope. Dry Hollow doesn't change overnight. The wooden walls were still faded. The main road was still covered in dust. The church still creaked whenever the wind blew through. But one thing had changed: the way people looked at each other. No more evasive glances. No more unfinished sentences swallowed back down. After the truth was spoken, the town didn't become richer, but it became lighter. Margaret Hale stood on the train station steps on a clear morning. She didn't bring much, just her old trunk, the one that had accompanied her for 8 years through towns like Dry Hollow, through investigations that were never reported in the press. This time the trunk looked lighter, not because there were fewer papers, but because some of the burden had been lifted. Ethan Cole came to see her off. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no sign of boisterous regret. He just stood there, his hand on the brim of his hat, as he always did when facing important matters. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of iron from the railway tracks and the smell of dry grass from the prairie. The scent of journeys and places to stay. "You don't have to leave right away," Ethan said, not to try and keep her, but to confirm. Margaret smiled very slightly. "I know." She looked around. Dry Hollow, a small, harsh town that had given her something no other place could offer. A community that dared to face the truth together. "I'm used to leaving," she said. "But this time, it's different." Ethan nodded. "Because this time she's not leaving because of failure." "No," Margaret replied. "Because it's finished." They stood in silence for a moment. There was no need to say more about what had happened. No need to relive the dangers, the tense nights, or the difficult choices. All of it was behind them, nestled in memory, where it belonged. "He has agreed," Margaret said, her voice tinged with confirmation. Ethan nodded. "They need someone who understands the land, understands the people. Not everyone wants to leave Dry Hollow and start over." Margaret looked at him. "You would be a good partner." Ethan gave a wry smile. "I never thought I'd do that." "He never thought he would stand up for himself either," Margaret said. The train whistle sounded in the distance, deep and drawn out like a deep breath from the outside world. Margaret picked up the trunk, turned around, and paused one last time. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you for believing in me," Margaret said. "Not from the beginning, but when it was hardest." Ethan placed his hand on his chest, where he could still feel his heartbeat whenever he had to make the right choice. "Thank you for not saving me," he replied. "For showing me that I can stand on my own 2 feet." Margaret nodded. She boarded the train, not turning back immediately. Only when the train began to move did she look out the window. Ethan stood there, fading from view but not weakening in the slightest. After the train disappeared from view, Ethan Cole stood still for a long time. Then he turned his horse, left the train station, and followed the road leading to Whinstone. The farm appeared before him in the midday sun. The burn marks were still there. The water wheel hadn't started yet. But there were new signs. A section of the fence had been re-erected, the soil had been tilled tentatively in the southern corner of the field, and the sound of hammers echoed from the shed where some neighbors were helping with repairs. Ethan dismounted and walked slowly across the yard. He touched the wooden post in front of the house, where Anna used to wait for him every afternoon. He felt no pain, only gratitude. The past wasn't erased. It was put back in its rightful place. That afternoon, Ethan returned to Dry Hollow once again. This time not to confront, but to begin. He was invited into a small room behind the church, where representatives of the town were discussing redistributing water, revising land contracts, and establishing a new system not based on fear. No one called Ethan a hero. No one cheered him. They simply asked for his opinion, and they listened. As the sun began to set, Ethan left town, returning to the train station. Not to see anyone off, but to leave. He brought very few things with him. A bag, a few changes of clothes, and some new papers. Not debt documents, but invitations to collaborate. Before boarding the ship, Ethan turned back for one last look at Dry Hollow. He didn't see a trap. He saw a place where he had learned to breathe again. As the train began to roll, Ethan Cole sat by the window, watching Whinstone disappear behind the vast prairie. He didn't know where the road ahead would lead him, but for the first time in years he wasn't afraid. Because he understood a simple yet profound truth. Love is not about staying at all costs. Hope is not a miracle, and rebirth does not come from forgetting the past, but from moving on without being bound by it. And in that harsh border region, amidst the dust and railway tracks, people who had been hurt learned to live decently once again. Not loudly, not perfectly, but strong enough for their hearts to open up again to tomorrow. Ethan Cole and Margaret Hale's story isn't a Western fairy tale where everything is resolved with guns or a perfect ending. It resonates with older viewers because of a very real truth. There are times when you've done everything right, But life still isn't fair. The first lesson the story leaves us with is a person's worth doesn't lie in how society values them. Ethan was considered a failure. Margaret was once seen as out of place, but it was precisely when they weren't trying to prove anything that they found their own dignity. The second lesson is more profound. Love heals not through salvation, but through respect. No one saves anyone in this story. Ethan and Margaret simply didn't turn their backs on each other when the truth became harsh. And sometimes just having someone willing to stand by you is enough to keep you going. Ultimately, the story reminds us that justice, hope, and rebirth do not come with fanfare. They come slowly, very slowly. But if people dare to live decently, they will come at the right time. If you're at a stage in your life where things aren't easy anymore, if you've ever thought, maybe it's too late, then this story is a whisper that it's never too late to live true to yourself. Thank you for listening to the end. If this story brought you a moment of reflection, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling gentle, humane stories. For hearts that have weathered many storms, frontier hearts, where ordinary people rediscover hope taking slow but sincere steps.